Many bombers employed by the combatants during World War II became famous, but very few became legendary. A great aircraft needed a quality which cannot be installed on the drawing board or in the factory. A truly great aircraft must have that touch of genius which transcends the good, and above all, it must have a great deal of luck. The luck to be in the right place at the right time. It must have flying qualities well above the average. Reliability, ruggedness, and fighting ability. And in the final analysis, it needs the skilled touch of its air crews to which it has endeared itself. All these things and more, the Avro Lancaster had in good measure. Despite its power-operated turrets, those abominations which plagued the wartime bomber designers striving for cleanliness of line, the Lancaster embodied a measure of grace which actually made it pleasing on the eye. Its neat aerodynamic shape contributed materially towards its excellent all-round performance. But like so many good aeroplanes, the essence of its design was its simplicity, its robust structure being ideally suited for mass production, and this was undoubtedly one of the main features for its success. It was also remarkably adaptable and a superlative bomber on every count. At first, using 4,000-pound bombs and smaller weapons, the Lancaster carried the war into the heart of Germany. It wasn't long, however, before it became the major offensive weapon of the RAF. By April 1942, it was carrying the 8,000-pound bomb, and by 1943, it had progressed to the 12,000-pounder. In the early days, navigation was largely by dead reckoning, and bomb aiming was entirely visual. Gradually, radar navigational aids such as Rebecca, G, and Oboe became available, and the H-2S radar bombing equipment, with its distinctive semi-opaque blister beneath the rear fuselage, became a standard fitting. The most remarkable offensive weapon to be used by the Lancaster was, perhaps, the bouncing bomb, which was to be used on one of the Lancaster's most spectacular and daring raids. It was dropped by the immortal 617 Squadron on the strategically important Mona, Ada, and Sorpe dams in the Ruhr. Wartime commander of Bomber Command, Sir Arthur Harris, heralded the Lancaster as the finest bomber of the war and added, "Its efficiency was almost incredible, both in performance and in the way it could be saddled with ever-increasing bomb loads without breaking the camel's back." The Lancaster far surpassed all other types of heavy bomber. Not only could it take heavier loads, it was also easier to handle, and, far more important to the crews, the casualty rate was also consistently lower than the others. Of all those great aeroplanes which fought out the war, there are many people who would insist that the Avro Lancaster was the greatest. In contrast to the Lancaster, the angularly ugly Armstrong Whitley, or the Flying Barn Door as it was known, was a familiar sight to people living on Britain's east coast during the early years of the war. The Whitley was the mainstay of the RAF bomber force for the first 2 years, in which the seeds of strategic night bombing were being sown. Although one of the least appealing bombers of the war, the Whitley did represent an important landmark in the history of the RAF's offensive capability. Few, if any, bombers of the Second World War enjoyed a longer or more distinguished operational career than the Vickers Wellington. Blooded in combat at the very outset of hostilities, it carried the lion's share of RAF Bomber Command's night bombing offensive until the operational debut of the 4-engine heavies, and it was still in the front line when the war ended. Indeed, such was the brilliant battle record of the Wellington that any tribute can be but a pale reflection of the distinctions that this remarkable warplane won for itself. In addition to their part in the strategic offensive, Bomber Command's Wellingtons made numerous attacks against Hitler's invasion forces, which were waiting in the Channel ports. During the same month, Wellingtons of No. 70 Squadron became the first long-range bombers to serve with the RAF in the Middle East. In addition, 2 more Wellington squadrons, No. 37 and 38, were also sent to Egypt to help in the Desert War against the Italians. 70 Squadron carried out the first night attack on Benghazi, and within a few months, the Wellingtons, or Wimpies as they had become affectionately known, had helped push the Italians back over the Egyptian border. They also fought in the Greek campaign against Rommel's Afrika Korps. By the Battle of El Alamein, there were 6 full Wellington squadrons in action in the Western Desert. The Wellington's docility, combined with a lively performance and the ability to absorb an outstanding amount of battle damage, rapidly endeared it to its crews, and its portly, well-fed appearance engendered the nickname Wimpy, after the strip cartoon character. The Wellington appeared in several wartime propaganda films, the most noticeable being the film Target for Tonight. This was the story of a typical bombing raid over Germany, following the mission from the early planning stages through to the final debriefing after the raid. Although it was based on a fictitious squadron flying from an equally fictitious airfield, The lead role was played by a 149 Squadron Wellington, F for Freddy. As the Wellington's wartime career gathered momentum during 1940, Vickers were producing 140 aircraft per month.
Go and get an ambulance, will you? The operator's copped it.
Come in, Dixon. I hear you made a nice landing.
I hope we haven't kept you waiting, sir.
Good Lord, no. Come and sit down. Well, how'd you get on?
Well, we did a low-level attack. We were over the target at 23:45. Bombs were dropped at 23:53. The first 4 bombs, I'm afraid, fell short of the target, but the last one was a direct hit.
Yes,
That was the big one.
Yes, it was a smasher right onto it.
Caused a hell of a great big fire. Buckets of smoke. Visible, 50 miles away.
Near 90, I should say.
What colour?
Dullish red with black smoke.
That sounds like oil, all right.
I'm afraid I didn't see very much. I was rather busy at the time.
Right. Well, that seems to be all. Good show. Good night.
Good night.
Group intelligence, please. Intelligence Militant speaking. Tonight's operations. Objective was reached and heavily bombed. Large fires and explosions were seen. All our aircraft returned. I'll send you details in the morning. Good night. Well, old boy, how about some bacon and eggs?
More than any other bomber, the Wellington proved the power-operated gun turret to be a formidable defensive weapon. But it disproved the widely held belief that large bombers could undertake daylight bombing raids against heavily defended targets without fighter escort. Like most successful combat aircraft, the Wellington was a result of teamwork, but it undoubtedly owed its success to the revolutionary geodetic or basket weave system of construction. This was an ingenious idea by Barnes Wallis, and even more remarkable because of its essential simplicity. Before the end of 1939, the Wellington was to achieve one doubtful distinction. It was to teach the RAF the hard lesson that the operation of such large aircraft by daylight without fighter escort was impractical. This lesson was driven home when 10 Wellingtons were lost and 3 badly damaged, out of a formation of 24, making an armed reconnaissance raid on Wilhelmshaven and the Schillig roads. The Wellington was from then on never again used by daylight unescorted, except in coastal and transport commands. With its transfer to a nighttime bombing role, the Wellington operated with conspicuous success, spearheading the RAF's night offensive against Germany. The Wellington was an aeroplane worthy of the Royal Air Force. It bore with distinction the name of a great British soldier. Other bombers came forward as the war progressed, but none enjoyed a finer reputation. When, in the summer of 1936, the Bristol Blenheim made its debut, it was immediately hailed as a major step forward in combat aircraft design, which placed the British aircraft industry in the forefront of fast day bomber development. It was the first modern all-metal cantilever monoplane of stress skin construction to be placed in production for the Royal Air Force, and, as such, it denoted the beginning of a new era in the equipment of that air arm. For several years, acute uneasiness had existed concerning the obsolescence of the RAF's operational equipment, uneasiness accentuated by developments abroad. The emergence of the Blenheim, representing such a tremendous technical advance over the aircraft which it superseded, did much to still this disquiet. More than any other aeroplane, it sounded the death knell of the fighting biplane. It set a pattern in the light bomber design which other nations were not slow to follow, yet the Blenheim was fated never to fulfill the very high hopes that were placed in it. One of the key types selected by the Air Ministry for the re-equipment of the rapidly expanding RAF of the late 30s, the Blenheim, at the time of its service introduction, was possessed of a performance which enabled it to outplace most contemporary service fighters. Yet such was the pace of combat aircraft evolution during those last 2 years of peace in Europe, that when the RAF went to war in September 1939, it soon discovered that the Blenheim was not the redoubtable weapon that it had supposed. Its shortcomings soon manifested themselves in the hard school of aerial combat. It was to prove woefully vulnerable to fighter attack. It was to be found deficient in both defensive armament and armor. Nevertheless, it was to bear the brunt of much of the fighting on every front to which the RAF was committed for the first 3 years of the Second World War. Despite its limitations, it was to serve valorously. A parallel might be drawn between the Blenheim and the Curtiss P-40. Like the American fighter, it was praised and abused, lauded and vilified, but it was all that was available, and however divergent were views of the effectiveness of the Blenheim as a weapon, it was one of the truly historic aircraft of the war. The short Stirling was not merely the first of the Royal Air Force true heavies of the Second World War. It was the only British four-engine bomber, designed from the outset to take 4 power plants, to see operational service during the conflict. The Lancaster and Halifax having both stemmed from twin-engine designs. Carrying bomb loads far greater than any previously contemplated, the Stirling proved one of the most important landmarks in the history of the RAF. Yet the official history of the RAF in the Second World War was to refer to the Stirling as a disappointment. In consequence, its career as a first-line heavy bomber was relatively brief. Nevertheless, as the RAF's first four-engine heavy of the Second World War, the Stirling occupied a particularly important place in the history of that air arm. The Avro Manchester, the predecessor of the Lancaster, was not a successful bomber. It proved to be unreliable and underpowered. Only 209 were built, and production of the type lasted barely a year. The Handley-Page Halifax, after some initial teething problems, did develop into an outstanding aircraft. Remaining in service until the end of the war, the Halifax maintained its position of one of the 2 principal RAF heavy bombers. The Hampden was one of the world's most advanced warplanes at the time of its debut, and it came of a distinguished line. It was a forgiving aeroplane from the pilot's viewpoint, and its ease of control rendered it an extremely pleasant airplane to fly. It was small enough to be highly maneuverable, its cockpit offered an excellent fighter-like field of vision, and it possessed a remarkable speed range.
This is a bomber factory in Britain. The workers have arranged with their management and their joint production committee to build a bomber in the record time of 30 hours.
Another film from the Ministry of Information was made to highlight the need for rapid production. In Workers' Weekend, a construction team from one of the 3 Vickers factories set themselves a target for producing a fully operational bomber in less than 30 hours. Narrated by an officer of the Royal Canadian Air Force, the film illustrates the effectiveness and simplicity of the geodetic design.
Everybody had the feeling, well, here we go. So we all took a deep breath and got set for 30 hours of non-stop real hard work. The clock strikes 9 and the record-breaking attempt begins. 2 sections of the fuselage are carried in. The dark girl with the riveter there is Eileen Daphne, who used to work in a rayon factory. One of her brothers was killed in a naval action a little while back. The fuselage parts are assembled in big frames they call jigs. These volunteer workers are giving the bonus they're earning today to the Red Cross Aid to Russia Fund. And they're out to break that 30-hour record they've set themselves. You can get some idea now of the size of the bomber. It's almost 65 feet long. Here is Evelyn Coates, an inspectress who used to work in a draper's shop. She told me at this point that she had found no faults at all. The workers were not only doing the job fast, but their work is perfect, too. Across the factory and the wing assembly, there is more activity under the eagle eyes of the inspectors. Though you may not think they're working fast, the progress they are making speaks for itself. For it's only 10 o'clock, 1 hour from the starting time. Grace Wally and Hilda Dodd are doing a man's job of work, assembling the bomber's cabin heater. Back in the main assembly, the wooden floor is fitted to the fuselage. Notice how everything fits with precision. There's no bullying the parts together. One fits willingly with the other. The forward bulkhead frame goes in, and then the pilot's seat, control column, and the cockpit floor all in one unit. And how's the time going? Well, they've been working 1 hour and 17 minutes. Testing the flaps on the wings is Eva Williams, a nurse by profession, testing fractures in tubes instead of in bones. There's our chief cameraman, Chick Fowle, trying to keep up with the work. The short, dark girl assembling the ailerons is 23-year-old Evelyn Homewood, whose husband is in the Royal Air Force. She was one of the first 5 women to work in this plant. At 10:27, the foreman gives the word, and into the framework of the aircraft pile the electrical workers, armed with the tricks and the tools of their intricate trade. One of the company test pilots, Gerald Whinney, he was in the Royal Air Force in France before Dunkirk, stood beside me and said ruefully, like a lot of bloody ants, hope they don't forget anything. But he had nothing to worry about. Construction went on, and the inspectors beamed with satisfaction. As you see, it seems to be a welter of wires, pipes, workers, shelves, fabric, and inspectors. But out of the clutter of confusion will emerge the completed fuselage. At 1:45 in the afternoon, the main fuselage is ready to come out of the jig. Let's flip over to the stitching and doping section. The 4 great sections which give the bomber its 80-foot wingspan are now being covered with fabric. Flashing fingers and winking needles. One wrong move, the needle would hit metal and the point would break. Agatha Hobson and the others who work here know where the stitches go. The fabric is bonded to the metal frame by about 8,000 tiny bolts, and stitches tidy up the edges. 8 stitches to the inch, and that's a whole lot of sewing you're looking at. Back at the fuselage, out at the tail, Vera Butler and her sister Joan worked together all the time. Vera was a lady's companion before she started building bombers 2 years ago. This is Phyllis Evans, who was in service as a maid before the war. She's one of them, fitting the fabric covering over the framework. And here is the process of weatherproofing and strengthening the fabric. The grayish-white material changes to dull red as the dope goes on. 9 coats are applied, but it dries quickly and there's no hold up here. It's a habit in this factory to rather brazenly autograph one's work, so we know that Blondie has had something to do with this bomber. We haven't looked at the power units yet. A tiny brunette, Eva Powell, who runs a crane away up there under the roof girders, brings an engine the length of the shop and gently lowers it to what they call the power egg or nacelle. It looks like an egg at that. Norman Martin over there was once 3rd officer on the pleasure liner Rawalpindi before she was converted to a merchant cruiser. Norman has been working on this type of aero engine for quite a time and thinks it's the finest in the world. The girl with him is Ailsa Grindley, who would rather work on engines than in the confectionery store where she used to work in peacetime. The time has come to bring the component parts together. This means that the various departments are delivering their finished sections to the main assembly, and here they come. Now we'll see it take shape as a bomber. The fuselage is trundled down the factory at 6:15 in the evening, 9 hours and 15 minutes after the start. The cranes come lumbering overhead with the power eggs, which are gently and firmly lowered into place and connected up. Next, the tail surfaces. The elevators and tail fin, like a big black sky knife, are lowered and connected. Each part is installed by a swiftly moving expert team. This is the bomb beam, like a compact miniature bridge. Look at the speed with which they set the bulletproof petrol tanks into the main planes. When this is done, the overhead crane picks up the wings and sweeps them into position where skillful hands guide them into place. Now the bomber is complete with its 80-foot wingspan. It won't be long now before this bomber is loaded with an outward-bound cargo for Germany at the rate they're going. The shift of workers changes. The night workers arrive along with the port air screw. At the same time, another crew is fitting the starboard propeller. And the time is only 23 minutes past 8 in the evening. The workers are beginning to make bets. For after all, there are still 17 hours and 20 minutes to go in that 30-hour mark they've set themselves. The rear turret arrives on a portable crane. Robert Davis skillfully guides it into place. He bruised his fingers nearly every day for a year, but now he handles the job as easily as he brushes his teeth. At 10:30 at night, the landing wheels are installed. wheels 4.5 feet high that weigh 300 pounds. I don't know if you noticed her, but Ivy Bennett caught my eye. I noticed her because she was wearing a very sheer pink chiffon blouse. I remarked on it, but Ivy grinned and said she'd come away from a party in a hurry so that she could get on this night shift and help to make this record-breaking bomber. These are the inner petrol tanks. Amazing, isn't it, the way every inch of space is used. Before our unbelieving eyes, the bomber really looks like an aircraft. Ernest Tootle, who used to be a coach painter, applies the RAF Randall on the fuselage and wings. I don't know where he gets that steady hand at 3 in the morning, for you'll notice that he does it freehand. Meanwhile, further inspections are taking place and checked off on the progress charts as each detail is okay. As the clock at the end of the assembly line points to 20 minutes past 3, a tractor tows the bomber to the running shed. This is a huge area at the end of the production line where final inspections and the first engine tests are made. There's a feeling of high expectancy in the air, for there in front of us is what we think is the fastest job of bomber construction in the world. Now, will it run? Like seagulls following a liner, the workers tag after it to continue their jobs. From Ivy Bennett in her chiffon blouse to George Williams, who is almost blind and at his lonely little workbench hammers 42 gross of screws a day into long strips of wood, every one of these British men and women has given of his best. Then, at precisely 15 minutes past 6 on this Sunday morning, exactly 21 hours and 15 minutes from the start of construction, the bomber is a complete fighting unit and sees the light of the first dawn of its lifetime. This is a very special occasion, so like a gallery at a sporting event, the workers stand and watch. Then comes the big moment. The engineer climbs into the cabin, and the engines are started up for the first time. More inspectors swarm about the bomber, prying into every nook and cranny. We all know that time is racing, but still a generator and an air screw need some last-minute adjustments, and there's a final bit of stitching to do. This holds us up almost 2 hours. Finally, the engines, electrical equipment, airframe, everything has received its final test and okay, and the bomber is ready for the takeoff. It's full daylight and 10 minutes to 9 in the morning. 10 minutes short of an exact 24-hour day that the finished bomber is rolled out onto the tarmac adjoining the factory. The record is going to be really shattered and no mistake. Comes the test pilot, Gerald Whinney, a really amazed man. He was planning to fly the bomber this afternoon, but so fast has this aircraft been completed that they got him out of bed to put the bomber through its paces. The record? Yes, they broke it, those workers. They said they'd build a bomber in their spare time in 30 hours. Its wheels lifted from the ground in exactly 24 hours and 48 minutes.
Named after William Mitchell, the far-sighted crusading American colonel of the 20s, who was court-martialed for his outspoken views on air power and posthumously raised to the rank of brigadier general, the North American B-25 was possibly the best all-round light-medium bomber of the Second World War. Operationally efficient, this docile, adaptable machine had an excellent all-round performance, and with particularly good handling characteristics, and it was one of the most popular of combat aircraft among all Allied air crews. Had the Mitchell never attacked another objective, it would have ranked among the most truly historic aircraft of the war for its fantastic attack against Tokyo in 1942, when it operated from the flight deck of the USS Hornet. It was manufactured in larger quantities than any other American twin-engine bomber, no less than 9,816 Mitchells being accepted by the USAAF, although many of these were destined to find their way to the British, Soviet, and other Allied air forces. The peak number of Mitchells in the USAAF service never exceeded 2,656 aircraft, but this exceptionally fine bomber made its mark on every far-flung front of the Second World War. One of the select band of Allied aircraft that could claim to have been engaged on every major battlefront of the Second World War, the Mitchell built up an unrivaled tradition of service. There can be few more dramatic examples of the consistent development of a basic design under the exigencies of war than that offered by this remarkable aircraft, which was destined to linger on in the service of many of the world's air arms far into the post-war era. Few other aircraft of the Second World War gained the universal affection of their aircrew over so long an operational period as did the Boeing B-17 Fortress. This legendary aircraft formed the spearhead of the American bombing offensive in Europe, from beginning to end, as well as serving in every other theater of war. No single aircraft type contributed more to the defeat of the Luftwaffe, both in the air and on the ground, than the Fortress, which enabled tangible expression to be given to the controversial United States policy for the strategic assault of Germany by day in the face of formidable political argument as well as desperate enemy opposition. A curious feature of the Fortress's history is that its reputation as the leading Allied day bomber was established, despite its inferiority in many respects of performance, compared with its combat contemporary, the B-24 Liberator. The bomb load of USA AF Fortresses over Europe was usually no more than carried by the diminutive de Havilland Mosquito. Far fewer Fortresses than Liberators were built, 12,677 Fortresses being accepted by the USA AF between July 1940 and August 1945. These equipped a maximum of 33 overseas combat groups by August 1944. The Fortress achieved fame on the strength of several outstanding attributes. Of these, perhaps the most important were an excellent high-altitude capability and the ability to absorb an amazing amount of battle damage. To these attributes were added, in its later variants, an exceptionally heavy defensive armament, though the true combat potential of the Fortress was achieved only after a long period of gestation. The Fortress had dropped over 640,000 tons of bombs on European targets during the war years. This compares with 452,508 tons dropped by the B-24 Liberators and 463,544 tons dropped by all other aircraft. According to records compiled by its manufacturers, the Fortress destroyed 23 enemy aircraft per 1,000 sorties, as compared to 11 by B-24 Liberators, 11 by United States fighters, and 3 by all United States light and medium bombers. Although it has been established that the very high claims of enemy aircraft kills scored by the Fortress were greatly exaggerated, there can be no doubt that the total was formidable. By its almost unrivaled period of first-line service, the Fortress proved itself one of the classic bomber designs of all time. Its performance proved a triumphant vindication of the principles of air strategy and bomber design established by a few far-sighted airmen and engineers in the United States of America long before World War II. While the Boeing Superfortress gained for itself undying fame as the first aircraft to drop an atomic weapon, thus bringing about the sudden termination of hostilities in the Pacific, it is also deserving of a place in the history of aircraft warfare as one of the principal Allied weapons in the war against Japan. The laborious and costly island-hopping campaign conducted in the Pacific by the Allied forces was undertaken largely to seize bases for superfortress operations against the Japanese homeland. Once bases had been established, the superfortresses of the United States 20th Air Force systematically and inexorably erased the industrial cities of Japan one by one with the terrible weapon of fire. The closely packed and lightly constructed Japanese buildings were extremely vulnerable to incendiary attacks, and the destruction wreaked by superfortresses in some built-up areas amounted to as much as 99.5%. In addition to these devastating blows against strategic targets, the superfortresses were simultaneously employed on a highly successful campaign of mine-laying in Japanese home waters, thereby applying an economic and logistic stranglehold to the islands of Nippon. The delivery of the 2 atomic bombs against Hiroshima and Nagasaki was, therefore, in the nature of a coup de grace, although essential to shorten the war. The superfortress was largely responsible for the final defeat and surrender of Japan without invasion, and the instrument which provided the ultimate vindication of the American visionaries of strategic air power. The superfortresses made an immense contribution to subsequent bomber design. It was the Second World War's heaviest production warplane, and the first pressurized aircraft to attain large-scale production. It was also the first to make extensive use of remotely controlled armament. But perhaps the most remarkable feature of its history was the fact that it was designed, built, tested, and placed in operational service within 4 years. Although each type had its staunch adherents, the Consolidated Liberator was somewhat overshadowed in fame, if not in achievement, by the Boeing Fortress during the Second World War. This was despite the fact that not only was the Liberator built in considerably larger numbers than the Fortress, it was produced in greater quantities than any other American aircraft. Such a unique production record is all the more remarkable for such a large 4-engine aircraft, and the Liberator operated over more fronts for a considerably longer period and was produced in a greater variety of versions than any other Allied or enemy bomber. By comparison with the Fortress, the Liberator was indeed an ugly duckling. Its deep, slab-sided fuselage and immense barn door-like vertical tail surfaces were features hardly indicative of speed and agility. One of the prime virtues of the Liberator, and one which invariably hallmarks a great warplane, was its versatility. In addition to strategic bombing, it was used with equal facility for maritime reconnaissance and anti-submarine operations, passenger and freight transportation, as a fly-air tanker, and for photographic reconnaissance, as well as for many other duties. It was this quality, in fact, which largely accounted for the extraordinary total of 18,188 Liberators and Liberator variants constructed by the USAAF between delivery of the first production aircraft in June 1941 and the closing down of the last assembly line on the 31st of May 1945. Apart from its unchallenged production record, the Liberator earned for itself a permanent place in aviation history for its remarkable record of achievement. Whether the material to be delivered happened to be bombs, depth charges, gasoline, freight, troops, or VIPs, the Liberator established a reputation second to none for doing almost any job, anywhere. In some respects, the combat career of the Douglas A-20 was much less spectacular than that of other bombers employed by the combatants. It was associated with no outstanding operations, but remained in frontline service throughout the war. It did not distinguish itself on any particular battlefront, but flew with equal distinction over all of them. It did as well in Russia as it did in the Pacific or the Western Desert, and withal, was one of the most pleasant of all combat aircraft to fly. Designated by the Americans as the Havoc and by the British as the Boston, the A-20 was a pilot's aeroplane, and its virtues were sworn in a variety of languages ranging from Afrikaans to French and from British to Ukrainian, as well as being operated by the Americans and Australians. Its cosmopolitan nature was fundamental in its design, however, for it owed its origins much to the Spanish Civil War, and subsequently to the urgent need for rearmament by the French. The danger signals of 1936 had not been ignored in the United States, and prominent aircraft manufacturers were considering the future possible requirements for the United States Army Corps, well in advance of any military specifications being issued. Well suited to the low-level bomber role, the Bostons, or Havocs, were adaptable, reliable, tractable, and extremely potent. Possibly overshadowed throughout much of its career by the more spectacular exploits which fell to the lot of other bombers, the A-20 did rank highly amongst the most brilliant combat aircraft designs evolved by the United States aircraft industry.
I'm speaking from London. It is late afternoon, and the people of London are preparing for the night. Everyone is anxious to get home before darkness falls, before our nightly visitors arrive. This is the London rush hour. Many of the people at whom you are looking now are members of the greatest civilian army ever to be assembled. These men and women who have worked all day in offices or in markets are now hurrying home to change into the uniform of their particular service. The dusk is deepening. Listening crews are posted all the way from the coast to London to pick up the drone of the German planes. Soon the nightly battle of London will be on. This has been a quiet day for us, but it won't be a quiet night. We haven't had a quiet night now for more than 5 weeks. They'll be over tonight. They'll destroy a few buildings and kill a few people, probably some of the people you are watching now. Now they're going into the public shelters. This is not a pleasant way to spend the night, but the people accept it as their part in the defense of London. These civilians are good soldiers. Now it's 8 o'clock. Jerry is a little bit late tonight. The searchlights are in position. The guns are ready. The People's Army of Volunteers is ready. They are the ones who are really fighting this war. The firemen, the air raid wardens, the ambulance drivers. And there's the wail of the banshee. The nightly siege of London has begun. The city is dressed for battle. Here they come. Now the searchlights are poking long, white, inquisitive fingers into the blackness of the night. These are not Hollywood sound effects. This is the music they play every night in London, the symphony of war. That was a bomb. very young and the very old, with that deep wisdom given only to the very young and the very old, sleep in the shelters. Do you see any signs of fear on these faces? Now the army of the people swings into action. The bombs have started fires. When the bomber starts a fire, he immediately returns, uses it as a target, and drops more bombs, hoping to spread the fire. Yet the People's Army ignores the bombs and the spent shrapnel which rains down constantly. Brokers, clerks, peddlers, merchants by day, they are heroes by night. The night is long, but sooner or later the dawn will come. The German bombers are creatures of the night. They melt away before the dawn and scurry back to the safety of their own airdromes. And there's the wail of the Banshee again, this time a friendly wail. The all-clear signal tells us that the bombers have gone. It's just 6 a.m. In this last hour of precious sleep, the strange new world finds peace. London raises her head, shakes the debris of the night from her hair, and takes stock of the damage done. London has been hurt during the night. The sign of a great fighter in the ring is, can he get up from the floor after being knocked down? London does this every morning. London doesn't look down upon the ruins of its houses, upon those made homeless during the night, upon the remains of churches, hospitals, workers' flats. London looks upwards toward the dawn and faces the new day with calmness and confidence. The People's Army go to work as they did in that other comfortable world which came to an end when the invader began to attack the last strongholds of freedom. Not all the services run as they did yesterday, but London manages to get to work on time, one way or another. In the center of the city, the shops are open as usual. In fact, many of them are more open than usual. Dr. Paul Joseph Gibbles said recently that the nightly air raids have had a terrific effect upon the morale of the people of London. The good doctor is absolutely right. Today, the morale of the people is higher than ever before. They are fused together, not by fear, but by a surging spirit of courage the like of which the world has never known. They know that thousands of them will die, but they would rather stand up and face death than kneel down and face the kind of existence the conqueror would impose upon them. And they know, too, and are comforted by the thought that England is not taking its beating lying down. They are guarding the frontiers of freedom. It is hard to see 5 centuries of labor destroyed in 5 seconds. But London is fighting back. I am a neutral reporter. I have watched the people of London live and die ever since death in its most ghastly garb began to come here as a nightly visitor 5 weeks ago. I have watched them stand by their homes. I have seen them made homeless. I have seen them move to new homes. And I can assure you, there is no panic, no fear, no despair in London town. There is nothing but determination, confidence, and high courage among the people of Churchill's Island. And they know that every night the RAF bombers fly deep into the heart of Germany, bombing munition works, airplane factories, canals, cutting the arteries which keep the heart of Germany alive. It is true that the Nazis will be over again tomorrow night, and the night after that, and every night. They will drop thousands of bombs, and they'll destroy hundreds of buildings, and they'll kill thousands of people. But a bomb has its limitations. It can only destroy buildings and kill people. It cannot kill the unconquerable spirit and courage of the people of London. London can take it.
No combat aircraft of the Second World War, either from the Axis or Allied powers, was the subject of so much modification and extemporization as was the Junkers Ju-88. Operating in various forms throughout the entire period of the European War, and still in production when the hostilities ceased, the Ju-88 was the true backbone of the Luftwaffe. This bomber was produced in greater numbers than all of the other German bombers combined, some 15,000 being built between 1939 and 1945. The Ju-88 was continuously adapted to perform roles other than that for which it had been conceived, and performed every task demanded of it with distinction. Like all combat aircraft, it possessed its share of shortcomings. These were largely due to changes dictated by the needs of the overstrained and depleted German defenses during the war's closing stages. Without doubt, despite its shortcomings, the Ju-88 was the finest German bomber to see extensive operational service. This aircraft was conceived as a result of a meeting held in 1935 between high-ranking officers of the then fledgling Luftwaffe and chief German aircraft designers. They were informed of the requirement for a Schnellbomber, meaning a medium bomber with the speed of a fighter. Junkers were finally awarded the contract, the prototype making its maiden flight in 1936. From the outset of war, the Ju-88 flourished to serve on every front and in almost every role. And apart from its use as a medium bomber, it also served as a night fighter, reconnaissance, torpedo bomber, mine layer, and finally as the lower half of the Mistel flying bomb. Highly regarded by the Allies, the Ju-88 was considered to exemplify the German philosophy of using one good basic airframe for a multitude of tasks, rather than evolving a variety of specialized machines, and thus complicating production. It is true to say that had the Ju-88 proved less amenable to the process of adaptation and modification to which it was eventually submitted, then the Luftwaffe would have found itself in serious difficulties at a very much earlier stage in the Second World War. Few were the inhabitants of England's capital and southern counties to whom, in the dramatic months of 1940, the distinctive and disagreeable note of the Heinkel He 111's engine was unfamiliar. For this machine, the first modern medium bomber to be acquired by the Luftwaffe, bore the major burden of the German bombing offensive against the British Isles during the main phase of the Battle of Britain. Despite its shortcomings, which became more marked as the war progressed, and which were in no small part due to the continual process of modification and extemporization to which the bomber was subjected, the He 111 retained its place as the standard Luftwaffe combat aircraft throughout the war. Produced in large numbers, this aircraft was twice taken out of mass production, only to be returned to the production lines when the new types with which it was to be replaced failed to materialize. During the opening phases of the war, the Heinkel He-111 was undoubtedly a formidable offensive weapon, an elegant, well-built, well-planned aircraft with good flying characteristics. It was certainly a thoroughbred, inheriting its shapely contours from its single-engine predecessor, the HE-70 Blitz, which at the time of its appearance had been justifiably acclaimed as the most aerodynamically efficient aeroplane ever to have flown. Like many German warplanes of its era, the HE-111 had first been shown to the world as a civil aircraft, but its sleek, streamlined fuselage was obviously designed for maximum performance at the expense of passenger comfort. However, intended from its birth as one of the Luftwaffe's principal weapons of the future Blitzkrieg, the HE-111 had placed Germany at the forefront of medium bomber development. It was, however, forced to soldier on long past its allotted span, owing to the inability of the German aircraft industry to produce a suitable replacement, and was already approaching obsolescence when called upon to carry the major burden of the Luftwaffe's bombing offensive against the British Isles. Despite continual improvements, it could not keep pace with the rapidly changing requirements of air warfare, and during the last years of the war was no longer the formidable weapon with which the Luftwaffe had attacked Poland. One design that did manage to see production was the Junkers Ju-188, a twin-engine medium bomber which first saw action in 1942. As early as 1939, Junkers had been working on the Ju-288, which was a completely new design far more advanced than preceding types. But when it became apparent that the design, which should meet a specification which called for the type to be in service by 1942, was not going to be developed in time, the Luftwaffe proposed that instead, the Ju-88 should be modified to meet the new requirement. Hence, in the interim, the Ju-188 was born. In principle, Junkers took the forward fuselage section of the Ju-88 and added a new wing and a new tail unit. This new design was designated originally as the Ju-88E, but this was later changed to the Ju-188E. The first aircraft left the factory in June 1942 for operational use as a dive bomber. However, with the increased defenses of the Allied forces, it was not particularly successful. Its role was changed to that of a medium horizontal bomber, and also as a torpedo bomber for attacking shipping in the Atlantic. Further developments took the Ju-188 into the night fighter role for defending Germany's homeland against the increasing Allied strategic bombing campaign. In order to achieve greater speed and altitude, without the disruption caused by the introduction of a completely new design, the Ju-188 was also developed into a high-altitude bomber with a pressurized cockpit section. This type later became designated as the Ju-388. In 1944, the role of the Ju-188 was changed again when it was used in the Pathfinder role during the year's bombing campaign against England. Operating from 1942 until the end of the war, seeing action in Europe and on the Mediterranean, Arctic and Eastern Front, the Ju-188 in its variety of roles was among the most important of the Luftwaffe's operational aircraft. Bomben auf England, so read the title of a stirring martial song which blared out of loudspeakers all over Germany and the occupied territories during the autumn months of 1940. With the accompaniment of roaring aero engines and the beating of drums, it was an impressive battle hymn. But whatever its psychological effect on the German populace may have been, it was hardly destined to raise the spirits of the personnel of the Luftwaffe. They were fully aware that their bombers did not have the range to attack effectively more than a small area of the British Isles. They knew that the Luftwaffe's lack of a long-range strategic bomber enabled the RAF to concentrate virtually the whole of its defensive strength within a limited area, an area to which the Luftwaffe was forced to confine its attentions. They also knew that this would sap their operational strength. Prototypes of four-engine heavies had been built, but they were abandoned and never saw the production lines. They did, however, possess the Heinkel He 177 Grief, a long-range twin-engine bomber, an aircraft which was destined to provide the most dismal chapter in the wartime record of the German aircraft industry. Fires in the air, aerodynamic troubles and structural failures all contributed towards the unpopularity of this big bomber when it reached operational units. The faults of this aircraft were recognized too late, and when they were recognized, insufficient energy was devoted to eradicating them. There was nothing wrong with the basic design, and had effective measures been taken, the Luftwaffe might have found itself possessing a heavy bomber comparable with, if not superior to, the best of the Allied machines of the same type. Aptly named the Grief, this aircraft's chief claim to fame was the fact that it was the only German heavy bomber to attain quantity production during the war years. It was, in fact, one of the very few entirely new German combat aircraft to progress from the design boards to operational service during the conflict. But the advantages that it offered were nullified by the German aircraft industry's inability to devote sufficient effort towards its perfection. Acclaimed by German propagandists as the scourge of Europe, the aircraft that conquered nations, the supreme weapon, the angularly ugly Junkers Ju-87 dive bomber attained greater notoriety than any other weapon in the arsenal with which Germany launched the Second World War. It was one of the most vulnerable of warplanes, slow, unwieldy, and the natural prey of the fighter. Yet within the first 9 months of the war, it had acquired an almost legendary reputation. The German air staff itself was divided on the subject of dive bombing and the employment of the Ju-87, but the Polish campaign appeared to vindicate its protagonists. The Ju-87 knocking out strong points, artillery batteries and concentrations whenever the Polish sought to make a stand. When the German offensive against France and the Low Countries opened in May 1940, the Ju-87 repeated its earlier successes, blasting the Allied armor and defenses, paralyzing whole armies, playing havoc with communications in vital rear areas, and hounding the streams of refugees. With virtually no aerial opposition, the Ju-87 was fully able to exploit the accuracy of bomb aiming inherent in the steep dive, as well as the demoralizing effect on personnel exposed to this form of attack. But the use of the Ju-87 presumed control of the air, and the issue was settled in the Battle of Britain when, After a few abortive sorties by Ju-87s, during which their formations were decimated by opposing Hurricanes and Spitfires, the dive bombers were withdrawn from the Cherbourg area, and the Ju-87's career had entered the eclipse. The Ju-87 was aerodynamically an atrocity. It was ugly to the point of absurdity, and it was virtually defenseless against the modern fighter. Yet its distinctive shape was the most feared by Germany's opponents, and this one aircraft type revolutionized the very fundamentals of warfare.